On Friday, December 29th, 2006. Inside a tiny concrete cell in a secretive location known to few, Saddam Hussein awoke unaware of what his guards already knew. The Super 12, an elite US military unit assigned to watch over him, had been on edge for days, anticipating a pivotal moment. That morning, their supervisors received confirmation. Plans were in motion. Saddam would soon leave the Rock, the island palace turned prison where he had spent his final months, and be transferred to Iraqi custody. For most of the guards, it felt like a distant inevitability, something they had spent months preparing for, but weren't fully ready to accept. Yet the signs of the end were unmistakable. His lawyers had visited, his family had been granted access, and just the day before, he had met with two of his half-brothers in a rare prison visit, a clear indication that something final was unfolding. Still, no one had spoken the words outright. Now awake, Hussein moved about his cramped cell like any old man burdened by time, complaining about his aching back and stretching his limbs. For nearly 3 years, US soldiers had guarded him, spoken with him, and even shared occasional laughter. Now, within hours, he would be erased from the world. The former dictator had ruled Iraq with an iron grip, his name synonymous with fear, war, and brutality, etched in blood through events like the 1982 Dujail massacre and the 1988 chemical attack on Halabja. Earlier, Saddam's defense lawyer, Naib al-Nawami, had speculated that the execution would occur on Saturday, December 30th, 2006. That speculation was no longer a possibility, it was a fact. The Super 12 had been officially informed. The execution was set for the next day. The waiting was over. The mission was now reality. Unaware that the order had been given, Saddam finished what would be his final meal, eagerly savoring lobster tails delivered from the Coalition Cafe at Camp Victory. Time in captivity had softened him physically. He had gained weight, once joking that he'd grown fat like an American. Hours later, he bid goodnight to the soldiers stationed outside his cell. Their watch was quiet as he lay on his cot. The guards dimmed the lights and lowered their voices to whispers, careful not to disturb him. Earlier that day, Sergeant Baglia had covertly sabotaged Saddam's transistor radio, ensuring he wouldn't hear news reports already buzzing about his looming execution. At 3 a.m. on Saturday, December 30th, 2006, First Lieutenant Andre Jackson stepped into Saddam's cell alongside his longtime interpreter. Trained as a military police officer, Jackson had never faced a moment quite like this. They switched on the light and entered. "It's time," they told Saddam, explaining he needed to prepare for his execution, set to occur in a few hours. Knowing his dislike for being rushed, they gave him ample time. Saddam received the news with calm detachment, almost as if he'd anticipated it. "I've been sentenced to death before," he remarked, unmoved. For the interpreter, who had spent 15 months in close interaction with Saddam, evolving from a professional dynamic to something he later described as a friendship, breaking the news was the hardest thing he'd ever done. Back in the United States, as President Bush retired for the night, National Security Advisor Stephen Hadley delivered the update. Saddam Hussein would be executed within hours. In Iraq, the timing was significant, coinciding with a sacred holiday for many of Saddam's supporters. Some claimed it was more than justice, it was a final act of humiliation. But for Iraq's new government, composed of those who had suffered under his rule, it was a long-awaited reckoning. Regardless of intent, one thing was certain: Saddam Hussein's time had run out. At 3:24 a.m., Saddam requested to bathe using the sink in his cell. The man who had inflicted so much pain now appeared as little more than an old man washing himself for the last time. The Super 12, stationed nearby, occasionally glanced his way but kept their distance, allowing him a final moment of dignity despite his history. Reports suggest some guards felt an unexpected empathy, grappling with the weight of the moment. Calm but deliberate, Saddam prepared for his end. A brief frustration arose when he struggled to find the right pair of socks, prompting a few soldiers to search through his belongings until they succeeded. Despite the morning's urgency, he remained composed, even pausing to ask if the guards had gotten enough rest. Saddam sat quietly, taking stock of his few remaining possessions: old books, scattered papers, and a handful of suits. He leafed through his writings one last time, ensuring his final thoughts were in order. A man who had once owned palaces was now reduced to this small, almost pitiful collection. After a moment, he called out, "My friend," as he often did when summoning a guard, and pressed his Raymond Weil watch, the one he frequently wore in court, through the bars. The guard hesitated. Accepting gifts was against protocol. "I can't take this," he muttered. "I want you to have it," Saddam insisted. "You were a good friend." The soldier protested, but Saddam smiled, clasping his wrist and sliding the watch onto it. "It's for you and me to know. I'm not going to tell anyone." Uncertain, the guard rationalized that accepting it might keep the night calm. Saddam then selected one of his finest suits, as he always did before public appearances, and drenched himself in cologne, so much that one soldier later quipped, "You could smell him from a mile away." By now, most of the Super 12 had gathered near his cell, dressed in full battle gear. Noticing them, Saddam walked over, chest out, standing tall. His voice was steady. "You've become more family to me than any Iraqi has." He said he would die like a soldier and thanked them for their kindness. One by one, he shook their hands. For the first time, the soldiers noticed tears sliding down his face. After a brief helicopter flight over a silent Baghdad and a cramped ride in an armored Rhino vehicle, the guards delivered the dictator to his final destination. The execution site was the former Istikbarat military intelligence headquarters in Baghdad's Kadhimiya district, once infamous for its torture chambers under Saddam's regime. Now called Camp Justice, the compound stood by the Tigris River, not far from where Saddam was born 69 years earlier. Security was airtight. An American brigade secured the perimeter, while Iraqi forces controlled the Gallows. The Americans, under strict orders, would not step inside. It had to be clear this was an Iraqi operation. As Saddam stepped out of the vehicle, his demeanor shifted. Each step seemed to harden his resolve, his stoic acceptance buoyed by the pride of a man who believed he was dying for his country. One guard later reflected, "You can watch a million movies about someone facing execution, but seeing it in real life, knowing a rope will be wrapped around their neck and they'll die, it's soul-crushing. And then for him to thank us, it was unreal." The guards waited outside, unable to see the gallows directly, but catching glimpses of shadows moving beyond the walls. The rope swayed in the cold breeze as they stood in tense silence. One couldn't shake a thought. Saddam's profound hatred of being hanged. Of all the ways to die, this was the one he dreaded most. Saddam Hussein was handed over to Muaffaq al-Rubai, Iraq's national security advisor and a former Shiite Dawa party member who had once endured torture under Saddam's regime. Now he led his former oppressor to the gallows. Inside, a judge read Saddam's indictments. Holding his Quran, Saddam remained calm and unrepentant. As he was led to the gallows, he paused on the steps, glanced at the setup and remarked, "Doctor, this is for men." His dark overcoat, upright posture, and refusal of a hood set him apart from the masked executioners. For Saddam, this was the final scene of his life, a moment he had long spoken about. He embraced death with unflinching pride, attempting to rewrite the humiliation of his capture 3 years earlier. The chaos around him told a different story. Some Shiite officials present began chanting Muqtada Muqtada, a reference to Muqtada al-Sadr, the powerful Shiite cleric and militia leader who had fiercely opposed Saddam. The chant was meant to taunt him, a reminder that his enemies now controlled Iraq. Saddam smirked. "Do you consider this bravery?" he mocked. When someone shouted, "Go to hell," he fired back, "The hell that is Iraq." The Super 12 sat in tense silence outside, the early rush of preparation fading into unease. Their mission was over. But what was happening beyond the walls felt far removed from the detachment of combat. Then came a sudden crash. For a moment it felt like an explosion, shaking the walls and rattling their chests. Inside, Saddam was halfway through the Shahada, the Islamic declaration of faith, when the trapdoor released. He hung for several minutes before a doctor confirmed his death at 6 a.m. Almost instantly, gunfire erupted outside. Not an attack, but a chaotic celebration from those who had waited years for this moment. Saddam's rule was brutal, but did his execution make things better? Did it bring stability or sow more chaos? His legacy remains a point of debate, but on that cold December morning, one chapter of Iraq's history closed with the swing of a rope.